Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. There's a couple of logistics that I'm going to go over as people are joining this webinar. The first is that this is a very large webinar, which is wonderful. We're so excited that you're here. But due to the size of this webinar, we have gone ahead and disabled the chat just to keep it a little bit easier for everybody to manage. However, we do have a Q&A feature, so please do use the Q&A to submit questions to our panelists at any time. We'll have multiple Q&A sessions after each sort of section of presenters. So please do ask those Q&As. We're also hoping to compile the questions that we maybe don't get to, because again, this is a large webinar, into some kind of FAQ document. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides and this recording will be sent to all registrants as well as posted to the CGS website and YouTube channel after the live event. So those will all be made available to everyone who's registered. And then just a general thank you to NSF for supporting this, which I'm sure will be echoed more by CGS President Suzanne Ortega, who will now introduce the content of this webinar.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to NSF for providing support for this important conversation and initiative. The empirical literature is clear. Graduate mentoring matters. Good mentoring is associated with timely degree completion, with smooth transitions into first jobs, and conversely, poor mentoring is associated with poor mental health of graduate students and attrition from degree programs. Over, I would say, at least the last 10 years, CGS and our graduate school colleagues have taken a lead in developing resources and programs designed to assist mentors and mentees in fostering healthier, more productive relationships. But despite these efforts, I guess we'd all conclude that mentoring remains uneven. Quality of that mentoring is uneven and access to mentoring is uneven. And therefore, NSF's new requirements provide one important new lever for change. We are really delighted to be joined by our colleagues from NSF, Sylvia Butterfield, who serves as the Deputy Assistant Director of the Directorate for STEM Education, and Daniel Deneke, who is the Lead Program Director for IGE, Innovations in Graduate Education. They will begin by explaining more about the criteria themselves. And as Sarah mentioned, the webinar will take place in 3 parts with opportunities for questions after each. Following the NSF presentation, graduate deans Deborah Jackson and Michael Solomon will talk about the work they are doing with graduate faculty and graduate students. And they will be followed by Vice President for Research, Ellen Fisher, who will talk about the intersection of responsible conduct of research training and mentoring. We will handle as many questions as we can, but given the size of today's audience, it's unlikely we will be able to directly respond to many, let alone most of the questions. So as Sarah mentioned, our intention following the website is to generate an FAQ document to respond to those overarching questions we are unable to address in real time. So at this point, I really would like to turn the floor over to Sylvia Butterfield and Daniel Deneke for their insights into the new mentoring requirements.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the NSF Directorate for STEM Education and the Division of Graduate Education, I want to welcome everyone to today's event. And I see there are over 700 attendees, which is amazing. Let me start by saying I'm excited that we're collaborating with the Council of Graduate Schools to discuss NSF's new mentoring requirement for graduate students. CGS's focus on advancing graduate education and promoting U.S. competitiveness completely aligns with our work at the U.S. National Science Foundation. And we know that strengthening the STEM community through graduate education and mentoring is vital to achieving our collective goals. So I'm pleased to communicate some important information about recent changes to NSF's Proposal and Awards Policies and Procedures Guide, or PAPG as we call it, which governs how proposals and awards are managed by NSF. If you're not already aware, the version of the NSF PAPG that becomes effective on May 20th, 2024 contains 2 new requirements related to graduate education. Number 1, all proposals to NSF that include support for graduate students must include a mentoring plan for those graduate students. And 2, all annual and final reports to NSF for projects that provide substantial support for graduate students must certify that the students had an individual development plan or IDP. Dr. Daniel Deneke from NSF's Division of Graduate Education will speak more about these requirements shortly. As you probably know, the Council of Graduate School and graduate deans across the country have been promoting the use of mentoring plans and IDPs, or individual development plans, for all graduate students for decades now. In fact, some of the work done by CGS has been instrumental in moving conversations forward about topics that have great bearing on the quality of graduate education in the United States. A few examples include the publications On the Right Track, the Manual for Research Mentors, Policies and Practices to Promote Student Success, Research and Student Supervisors, and Supporting Graduate Student Mental Health and Well-Being, all topics that Suzanne alluded to in her opening remarks. Building on and in parallel with other efforts, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Mathematics in 2018 published their report, Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century, which was commissioned by NSF's Division of Graduate Education. The final chapter of this document is entitled A Call for Systemic Change, outline a vision for an ideal STEM graduate education. That vision included 2 points relevant to mentoring. First, institutions would help students identify advisors and mentors who can best support their academic and career development. And second, institutions would provide faculty with training, resources, and time, both to improve their own skills as mentors and to provide for quality mentoring and advising to the graduate students they supervise directly, as well as other students in their department or from across the institution as is appropriate. The same chapter includes recommendations for federal and state government agencies. And Congress, it seems, was also paying attention to all of this, as they also included new requirements, which we've incorporated into NSF's PAPG in the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. So why is this important? It's important because NSF has a mandate to contribute to the continual enhancement of the national STEM enterprise. This, of course, means investing in the development of STEM talent, including future STEM leaders. We all know that graduate students are the nation's future STEM talent, and many of them will go on to become STEM leaders. That is why investing in them financially is important, as NSF frequently does through grants and other financial award instruments. And it's why we've established these new requirements to ensure that the institutions to whom the awards are made are also investing in nurturing these students, which is so vital to their success. The old days of look to the left, look to the right, one of the 3 of you won't be here when graduation comes around, those days are gone. Future STEM talent is a valuable national resource, and we cannot squander the opportunity to prepare that talent to persist in STEM. They are the talent, this is the talent that will contribute to improved social conditions, sustainability, scientific innovation, economic prosperity, and national security. In closing, I want to thank everyone here again. The entire graduate education community, including the Council of Graduate Studies and other organizations, are to be commended for their leadership on issues related to improving graduate education. Without their efforts, the mentoring plan and IDP requirements now being implemented by NSF would not be possible. So with that, I want to thank you again and turn the Zoom over to Daniel Denicky. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to echo Dr. Butterfield's thanks to the Council of Graduate Schools for hosting this discussion to raise awareness in the graduate community about new NSF requirements and expectations for mentoring of graduate students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And thank you all for your interest in better understanding these new requirements and your commitment to quality mentoring. CGS asked NSF to frame today's webinar by providing a brief overview of the new NSF requirements for graduate student mentoring plans and individual development plans, specifically why these are being implemented, why they're important, and to outline expectations for principal investigators. Dr. Butterfield has already addressed the rationale for requirements and their importance. Now, I'll just briefly discuss in more detail a bit about what these requirements are specifically, how they'll be implemented, and our expectations of PIs. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, so these requirements are published in the new NSF PAPG, Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. The publication number is NSF 24-1, and they're effective for all proposals submitted to NSF after May 20th, 2024. First, I'll discuss the mentoring plan requirement. This is virtually unchanged from the previous requirement for mentor plans for postdoctoral researchers supported on NSF projects. NSF now, as authorized by the America Competes Act of 2022, expanded this requirement to include all graduate students supported on NSF projects. Next, please. I'm sorry, I think the previous slide. We somehow went ahead of the previous slide. Okay, the next one. Okay, here we are. There we go. Some important points. Again, this is effective for proposals submitted to NSF on or after May 20th, 2024. These plans are to be submitted as part of the supplementary documentation section for proposals submitted in research.gov. The plans are limited to 1 page. Plans must address postdocs or graduate students on the project. Now the language here says or, but this is really an and/or. Plans must address postdocs or graduate students on the project, and separate plans are not required for postdocs or graduate students. That, in other words, they can be combined into one plan, and you could specify differences in the ways mentoring will be provided for postdocs and for graduate students. NSF, as you may know from the postdoc plan requirement, does not prescribe what these plans must include and recognizes the unique relationships between a mentor and mentee and the different forms that graduate mentoring may take. Many of your institutions may have templates for mentoring that may be adapted to the new graduate student requirement. Some examples provided include career counseling, training and proposal preparation, publications and presentation, guidance on teaching and mentoring skills working in diverse teams, whether diversity by background or by discipline, and responsible professional practice. Mentoring activities, it should be noted, will be evaluated under the broader impacts criterion. It's also worth noting, though this is not on the slide here, that the PAPG stipulates that if a PI transfers from one organization to another post-award, this requirement follows the PI to the new institution. Okay, next, please. Okay, so that is the new mentoring requirement, again, which is virtually identical to the prior requirement for postdoctoral researchers, except this now applies to graduate students. The plan will be submitted along with proposals and will be evaluated as part of the broader impacts criterion. Now I want to note the second big new requirement, which is for individual development plans for postdoctoral scholars or graduate students. This requirement is entirely new and also authorized through the CHIPS and Science Act, and also effective for proposals submitted on or after May 20th, 2024. Next, please. So I just want to pull out some of the key information here. This applies to graduate students receiving what is called substantial support from an NSF award. These individual development plans must be updated annually, and these individual development plans must be certified by the principal investigator, and they will do so in the process of submitting their annual and final project reports. So what does substantial support mean, and what will be expected of PIs? Next slide, please. So substantial support is defined as 1 person month per year. And if you've worked on preparing NSF budgets, you have experience preparing budgets for those typically on 9-month or 12-month appointments, and perhaps have guidance from your research offices on how to identify a person month. Here, just basically, we provide some kind of overall guidelines for what this might mean in practice for graduate students on assistantship. So, for example, any graduate student who is supported for more than about half a semester at full support associated with 20 hours a week commitment, or about 1 semester at half support associated with 10 hours a week commitment, would be considered typically to be working 1 person month or more. And then next slide, please. And then just to define support. So support here may be in the form of stipend and or tuition. And here's the relevant uniform guidance that defines stipend and tuition. However, graduate student support is intended to provide support for students pursuing a graduate degree, but typically their time commitment here is in addition to or beyond their educational time commitment for the institution. And lastly, I just want to conclude by sharing that the Division of Graduate Education has supported some projects designed to generate knowledge on effective graduate mentoring and individual development plans, in particular through the Innovations in Graduate Education program that Dr. Ortega mentioned. I look forward to exploring how, working with CGS and others, we might make the results of these funded projects available and accessible to PIs in STEM fields, so they might respond to these new NSF requirements in ways that are most supportive to the success of all STEM graduate students. So thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, audience, for your questions. Let me try to get some of the most relevant ones before you, Daniel. One of the first questions was, will NSF provide an IDP format, or does the format really depend on department and institutional frameworks?
So my understanding is similar to the postdoctoral mentoring plan. Mentoring plan and what will be the graduate student mentoring plan. NSF will not be providing a standard IDP template or format. However, there are a number of studies out there that have resulted in instruments that could be commonly applied to be used by institutions to provide IDPs for their students. Yes.
Another interesting point is, while NSF doesn't require separate plans for postdocs and graduate students, could a PI choose to submit a separate mentoring plan?
So you should look at the language of the PAPG, which I cited, NSF 24-1. I think it's open to interpretation. I think the language is may, that you may differentiate the postdoctoral and the graduate student plans. And I think what you should just be considering here is that reviewers will be looking at the mentoring plans. And so reviewers, depending on how the roles of the postdocs and the graduate students are defined in your project, the reviewers may or may not be looking for a plan that provides that differentiation. So NSF doesn't have a uniform answer to that question, but you should look at the PAPG and then really consider how you differentiate those roles in your project.
Thanks, Daniel. Here's another interesting question. Does this new requirement apply to master's students? And how, if at all, does it affect GRFPs?
It would apply to master's students who are supported on NSF projects and grants. So the answer to that is yes. And with respect to GRFP and with respect to any NSF program, I would encourage you to look at the program solicitation just to be sure. But the assumption is that this plan will apply to students who are supported on NSF projects. So I have to defer to my colleagues in the GRFP program to understand that program's requirements.
Here's another question. I'll try to, it cuts across 2 or 3 questions, and I'm going to try to summarize it. The question is, first, it's not the universities that collect the IDPs, question mark, but it is the faculty PI who has to document through an IDP and their annual report that in fact they have been monitoring and making use of this technique. And I'll follow that by right. Is that a correct assumption? And does this IDP requirement for annual reports, does it affect current grants, i.e. grants awarded prior to May 20th, 2024?
So this requirement applies to proposals submitted on or after May 20th, 2024. So it would not be retroactive. My understanding is that there are institutions that do collect and provide guidance to PIs, to mentors on perhaps a common IDP platform. And they may well help to provide sort of storage and access to those IDPs. However, yes, the certification process is entirely that of the principal investigators at the time of reporting. And so NSF will not be collecting or requesting as part of the annual report process, at least as guided by the PAPG. Will not be asking or requesting the IDPs in particular at that time.
And point of clarification there too, Daniel. The students' IDPs, do they get submitted with the required program annual progress review annually?
No, this is just, this will be just principal investigators certifying that there is an annually updated IDP for those supported graduate students.
But the IDP itself is not submitted as part of the
That is not the requirement of the NSF new guidelines. That's correct.
So I think there's a question I can actually answer, which is, will results from those IGBE projects that relate to mentoring be available in the CGS Innovation Hub? And I will say absolutely, but you could reinforce it, Daniel.
Well, that's terrific to hear, Suzanne. Yeah, one of our hopes in helping to host this webinar was to work with CGS, who does host the IGE Innovation Acceleration Hub, IGE Hub, and through that we seek to sort of spotlight and highlight some of the findings coming out of the projects on mentoring generally. And on individual development plans specifically. So yeah, thank you, CGS.
Here's a question. Are these professional development plans required for all directorates within NSF, i.e., and I'm sorry, I don't know what DMS is, but that's what the question is.
Division of Materials Science, I believe, and it's correct that it would apply to all NSF funded projects that involve and include graduate students. I'm sorry. So the individual development plan, those students who are working on those projects in terms of significant support, as I defined in my presentation. For the mentoring plans, yes, it would include all graduate students who are supported by those projects, or engaged in those projects, regardless of STEM directorate or division.
There's an interesting question about the impact for or the what would be required for students who are enrolled in combined bachelor's and master's degrees programs. Would mentoring plans be expected for these programs as well?
This is one of the questions I would have to say, I don't know the answer, but I would imagine that the answer may depend upon the case of those students. So if those students are involved in an NSF funded project and they're in a dual degree, then they could potentially be defined as master's students, that these would apply to those students as well. But that's probably a conversation you would want to have with your program officer.
So, Daniel, can you explain what the acronym GRFP stands for?
Graduate Research Fellowship Program. So these are individual awards to graduate students for graduate study. They're portable fellowships. And so it's not an award to an institution or award to a principal investigator who will then work with multiple graduate students. So it's a somewhat different type of funding mechanism. It's a direct fellowship.
There are a lot of questions about how this might apply to GRFP recipients. And our colleague Sharice Carney-Nunes writes in the questions, the requirement will apply to GRFP, but program-specific guidance is coming soon. Please stay tuned. Daniel, one of the real questions about thinking about this component of a proposal, this one maximum of 1 page as part of the text of the proposal, is what kind of instructions are reviewers going to be given in terms of how to judge the quality or the broader impacts or the integrity of the plan itself? What guidance will reviewers be given?
So this is a great question. I would say that the guidance will vary by program. However, this is an NSF requirement, and increasingly our panelists are applying the standards that they have developed in community through working with their colleagues and working through the NSF review process. So just as we saw, I think, with the postdoctoral mentoring plans, perhaps in the beginning, reviewers weren't quite sure what to do with them. Very soon, after a cycle or two, panelists had quite good feedback and experience with respect to looking for more than the minimum and looking for significant mentoring support and having significant things to say about the quality of mentoring. So this will be an evolving dialogue with our reviewers, and some reviewers in different programs may have more or less expertise in studies on mentoring. We'd like to make that knowledge more widely available to everybody, but I believe that the knowledge of what is quality mentoring is diffusing throughout the community, has done so through the postdoctoral mentoring plan, and will do so in a similar vein with this requirement for graduate students in the merit review process.
There are a number of questions, I think, all organized around the underlying question, Daniel, is if Is there an enforcement or an evaluation mechanism that tests the reality of the use of IDPs and its effectiveness against sort of the more mechanistic requirement that you report that such a thing exists? How are we thinking about the accountability piece?
This is a terrific question. I think what I would say is one of the reasons why NSF is so interested in working with the Council of Graduate Schools is that we can work together with graduate deans, with senior administrators, and work as we are today with individual principal investigators to diffuse knowledge about what resources are out there, what seems to work, but also complement that with perhaps some accountability in terms of these are quality plans, and these are plans that are maybe not serving students well. So while NSF is not currently seeking to collect IDPs, I think that conversation should be happening at multiple levels within the program, within the departments, within the institutions, and nationally.
I think there are also a series of related questions. Again, I think exploring the question of for which students is a mentoring plan required. So for example, there's the question of what if a student's primary source of support was as a teaching assistant, but they participated in a lot of laboratory or funded project research? Would a mentoring plan be required for that student? What about students in post-bac programs? They've completed their undergraduate degree, but have not yet been admitted to graduate study.
There's some of these questions that I think that the nuances of policy implementation, I'm not familiar with the details about how the policy will apply. And I would suggest that as you're preparing proposals, if that's not addressed in developing perhaps frequently asked questions around this new requirement, that perhaps through your cognizant program officer to whom you're applying, we could try to answer those questions as you're submitting a proposal and provide that guidance.
Daniel, here's a question for CGS, which perhaps I can partly answer, and then I'm going to ask for your help in completing the answer. The question is, will other federal government agencies, NIH, USDA, etc., require the same kinds of things? And I think the answer is that NIH already does, has very similar kinds of requirements. I am less certain about the other major funding agencies that support research that frequently includes graduate students. Do you know?
I would only presume to speak for NSF about these requirements at this time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. I think we probably have time for one or two additional questions. Again, a question I think that is in the area of what kinds of personnel, both in technicality, but I guess in spirit of the mentoring requirement, really do we need to address? And this question asks, what about lab technicians, which may not be exactly a postdoctoral appointment or exactly a graduate student? If you're requesting a postdoc and there's a technician accompanying that team, do you need to include an IDP for a technician?
So the requirements only apply to the populations that are specified in the requirement. These are minimum requirements, but in no way should preclude having more inclusive mentoring plans for those who could benefit from mentoring. We understand mentoring could benefit early career faculty and could benefit administrative staff, could benefit techs in labs as well. So, but the requirements only apply to graduate students and postdocs, the requirements we're presenting today.
And maybe just one last question. If I can relocate it, I will, Daniel. There's a question about if a already approved project went through a major rebudgeting exercise subsequent to May 20th. Would it be wise or required to have a mentoring plan in place, or be able to communicate it and include it in those grant processes?
That's really a question that you should ask to your cognizant program officer. It will really sort of depend upon the phase or the stage of the official award notice. Are you in the process of a budget negotiation and you have not yet received an award? Are you in a process where you have a letter of interest and perhaps there was a budget negotiation prior to the submission of the official quote unquote proposal? So I really can't answer that that's to be answered on a case by case basis, depending on where you are. Yeah.
I lied. We have time for one more question and then we'll turn it over to the next section. And this, I think, is a question about really, what does it mean for a PI to certify that there's an IDP in place? How detailed, how extensive is that certification supposed to be? I suppose this is a question about authenticity and about expectations that a PI will document and is able to certify that one has been created and is used.
This is a terrific question, and I hear a little bit of a question about agency here too. I was just having a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about, well, is the IDP really, should it be the purview of the PI, to be certifying this, or should graduate students themselves be the owners and the agents behind their IDPs? And I kind of believe both. I believe that graduate students are the authors and the agents, and that this is part of a tool to help them shape their own professional development, to clarify their own professional goals, their career goals, and to ensure they're getting all of the resources that they need to meet those goals. However, they're also incredibly valuable tools to structure conversations between research advisors, other mentors in their institutions, perhaps even beyond their institutions, and those students. And so, in a sense, it's a check to make sure that the PI is aware that there is a conversation that needs to be happening with their students about their individual development, and that it helps to contextualize that mentoring relationship or certify the mentoring relationship as a common document that's in the student's best interest. So I think the answer is both. The answer is yes and yes.
Daniel, I think at this point, I want to thank you for presenting. I hope you'll stick with us for the rest of the conversation, and I know we will be calling on you in the generation of frequently asked questions. But at this point, I'm going to turn the webinar over to my colleague, Carrie Moorhead, who will moderate the next session.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you, Daniel, and your colleagues at NSF. My name is Carrie Moorhead, and I am the Council of Graduate Schools Dean in Residence. It is a great pleasure for me to be on this webinar this afternoon. And as part of the section 2 of our webinar, I am going to introduce you to two colleagues, Deborah Jackson, Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of Academic Programs at California State Bakersfield, and my other colleague, Michael Solomon, Graduate Dean at the University of Michigan. Deborah and Michael are here this afternoon to share with us how they go about creating and supporting high-quality mentoring practices for graduate students. I believe that Deborah will be joining us first.
Thank you so much, Carrie. One of the questions that's come up in the previous discussion is about determining what effective graduate mentoring is. And I'll be speaking about that a bit today. At CSU Bakersfield, my colleague and I, Anna Jacobson, have directed a grant from the Department of Education, and mentoring is a big part of that. And what I want to talk about today is how we've used what the literature says about mentoring as part of our project. We've tested some assumptions about strategies that work with our students. And then we've also done some evaluation of the effectiveness of mentors. And depending on how much time we have today, I'll be able to get through some of this, but I believe the slides will all be shared with everyone who's registered for the webinar. Can you do the next slide, please? So the project that we've been working on, we're in the 5th year of this project, is promoting excellence in graduate education and increasing Hispanic STEM-related degree completion. This is a PPOA grant funded by the Department of Education. And we've really had 2 big goals as part of this project: to build capacity at our institution and also to build graduate going culture at our institution. We are not authorized to offer PhDs. Most of our students are master's students, although we do have some doctoral. We have 1 doctoral program, and we're about to start another doctoral program shortly. Next slide, please. Well, as I mentioned, a big component of our grant has been focused on improving mentoring. And we've had 2 major pieces of that project. One has been focused on faculty development, the development of faculty as mentors to share best practices and to build community among faculty and to work together to develop resources for each other and really think about how to best serve our students. And so we focus very, very much on inclusive mentoring practices because, as I said, our project is a PPOA project, and we're really focused on increasing the number of Latinx students who are pursuing graduate degrees in the sciences. A second piece of our mentoring program has been focused on collaborative research. And so we funded projects where faculty and graduate students are collaborating on research projects. Both the faculty member and the student get funding for that. We've had 3 cycles of each of these. Our first cohort of faculty faculty mentoring program had 7 faculty members. The second one had 12, and the third one had 8. Those are year-long projects. Similarly, with a collaborative research project, it's a year-long project with 8 pairs in cohort 1, 8 in cohort 2, and 9 in cohort 3. Next slide, please. So first, I want to talk about the resources that we've provided to the faculty. And all of these are grounded in the literature about what effective mentoring is, in particular, thinking about inclusive mentoring practices. Next slide. We've developed, using that literature, some inclusive graduate student mentoring guidelines where we, help faculty understand how important it is to directly address equity and inclusion in their mentoring, how important it is to demystify graduate school and establish clear expectations for students. A lot of our graduate students are first generation, so they don't have a network of family members who have explained to them what graduate school is about or what to expect from it. So we need to make sure that we communicate that effectively to our students. We really want to encourage the effective use of time, model and cultivate ethical behavior, assist with finding other mentors, because of course, mentoring is not something you should only get from one person. You need multiple mentors for different aspects of your work. And then the importance of meeting regularly with mentees. Next slide. We also have developed some mentor and mentee expectation worksheets. These are especially helpful for communicating what to expect and trying to create some consistency among all of our mentors, what the mentors are expected to do as mentors, and also communicating to the mentees what their responsibilities are in communicating with their mentors. Next slide, please. The big thing that I want to really talk about here is about the kind of research that we've embedded into our mentoring program. So I'm going to talk about two case studies. Next slide, please. The first here is really, this research that we've done has good scholars. We need to really test our assumptions about what effective mentoring is, what's working and what's not working. And so in our second cohort, one of the things that we focused on was not just sort of learning about the research about mentoring, but actually finding out, is this particular strategy working with our students? So one faculty member tested some beliefs about a writing hour. So his goal was to really provide space or support for graduate students to engage in the research project process. And he predicted that students lacked time and focus that would inhibit their writing process. And he got some feedback from his students by doing this. Next slide. What he found was some pieces of it were really helpful. It really helped to develop a writing hour with his students that gave them dedicated time, really put folks on the same page. They really built a community with each other by discussing and talking through their challenges, a lot of support of each other. And what they found was that the faculty member and the students had similar experiences. So I want to emphasize here that this writing hour was not just space that the faculty member dedicated for the students to work on writing, but he himself engaged in that writing hour practice with the students. Some of the barriers that he discovered in the process was that students were really uncomfortable with writing research. They faced lots of challenges in their lives. This is during COVID that this project was funded, and they also had to sort of balance their course assignments. But ultimately, what he found was that the students and the faculty were able to publish their scholarship by creating this community of a writing hour. They had a record number of thesis projects that were published from that cohort. And really the students found themselves being very supported. They reported that they felt supported, and it really built strong rapport between the students and faculty. It was really important for the students to see that faculty also struggle through the writing process, because we often just see the product, we don't see the process itself. And demystifying the writing process for students was very, very valuable for them. Let's go to our second example, please. The second example here is grounded in the faculty members' assumptions about why students were not publishing their thesis. And his assumption was that they really didn't have financial resources. And he wanted to test that assumption. Was he correct? Because he had been really focusing all of his attention on getting funding for the students, but he hadn't stepped back and asked the students what really got in their way. And so he did a survey with his students to find out, like, what are the barriers that you're facing when you try to publish your thesis? Next page, please. What he found was that funding was not the issue, despite him thinking that it would be. But instead, he found that the main barriers were, first, that they didn't have the strong analytical skills. They needed some more support for that. And then secondly, they really lacked some confidence in the quality of their work. And we know a lot about students from underrepresented backgrounds and from students that are first generation, that imposter syndrome can really get in the way of their success. And so what he discovered that the students were reporting that. So that allowed him to then alter his mentoring practice. Instead of focusing all of his attention on trying to get funding for the students, he was able to pivot and think about what do I need to do to strengthen the analytical skills of the students that I work with, and how do I build their confidence? How do I work with them to combat imposter syndrome, and to help them understand, as the previous writing hour faculty mentor discovered, that that it's a struggle. Like, writing is hard, and developing resilience when you get rejection, and keeping at it is really important for the students to be able to see and understand. Next slide, please. A second piece of what we worked on was helping our faculty understand what is working as in terms of their mentoring. And so we did some self-assessments with the faculty mentors. Next slide. The self-assessment of mentoring practices was based on some mentoring program standards. We administered these to the faculty at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year. Next slide, please. And here I want to just highlight a couple of the things that we found. We found that faculty perceived their that whether a faculty member was working with students who were progressing at a good rate, at an expected rate, whether they were good at that or not, that the faculty who were not that were mentoring students, but those students were not progressing at the expected rate, actually ranked themselves equal to or slightly higher than the faculty members who were working with students that were progressing at the expected rate. We also found that the faculty members whose we call ROP, rate of progress, so those low ROP mentors reported significant improvement in their mentoring skills, while the high ROP mentors reported very little change. One of the things that was really interesting is that the faculty who we call low ROP mentors, that they were mentoring students who were not progressing at the rate expected, they actually believed themselves to be better as mentors than the faculty who were high ROP mentors. Next slide, please. And here we also found that the faculty who are high ROP mentors, what they had to say about their experience was very consistent with what the graduate students said about their experiences. Next slide. Whereas the faculty who were low ROP mentors, the ones whose students weren't progressing as well, there's some discrepancies between what they reported that they were doing and what their experience was versus what the students' experience was. Next slide. So, one of the, we've got to think about, like, how do we determine what's working in our mentoring? How do we give that feedback to faculty as we look at what their beliefs about their mentoring skills are as compared to what the outcomes are, and that we have to sort of figure out how to create a feedback loop so that faculty who are not being effective mentors can develop new skills so that they can be effective. So I just wanted to share that with everybody about how we've been trying to think about evaluating the effectiveness of our mentoring so that we can strengthen mentoring practices as a whole at our institution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. As we mentioned earlier, we'll take questions after each section. At this point, I would like to turn the mic over to Michael.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Mike Solomon. Could you please back up 2 slides? You're going on. Great, thank you. I'm delighted to be able to address you. I'm at the University of Michigan. I'd like to describe some of the supports we've put together at the university centrally to support faculty as they have sought to mentor their graduate students, particularly their PhD and doctoral students. One caveat, I'll be describing today a project that dates for many years, so it's not, of course, it's not directly responsive to today's NSF requirement, but we do think it's going to really help us as an institution to, as PIs are now submitting mentoring plans as part of their proposals and certifying them as part of their final reports. So in a nutshell, we have been at the graduate school seeking to offer resources so that faculty can write mentoring plans, and that was an early decision as something that we could do to support the progress of PhD students at the University of Michigan. Next slide. The drivers for this project, which date more than 10 years, I would say there's both long-standing and recent drivers, and I saw that in the Q&A, some of these reports have already been mentioned. I think from the experience of faculty on campus, as well as written into reports from the national academies, there's a recognition that the success of PhD students, their sense of belonging is directly facilitated by the central mentoring relationship with faculty members. This is particularly important in the case of when mentor and mentee have different identities, and students really need an individualized approach to their academic progress, and mentoring can really make all the difference. And then more recently, as challenges around the mental health and well-being of graduate students have come into the fore in graduate education, there is a thought that once again, the faculty member, though not a mental health professional, is centrally located to try to kind of moderate some of the academic stress that can contribute to well-being. So those are the drivers that we were cognizant of at the University of Michigan as we launched and began this project. Next slide, please. So our model to try to promote, to create resources so that faculty can have tools to bring to this these mentoring relationships is to rely on other mentors on campus. It's really a faculty engaging with faculty model. What we have used is what we call the MORE committee. MORE stands for Mentoring Others Results in Excellence. It's a faculty committee with a rotating membership. Typically, faculty are on the committee for 3 to 6 years. It's a membership of 10 to 12 faculty members that span across the whole institution. For those of you that have institutional roles, this structure might be of interest to you. For those of you who are PIs and that are interested for resources, I'll try to describe some of the resources that this committee has put together. This faculty committee really engages with other faculty and graduate students on campus with the goal of fostering conversations and written plans around mentoring. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the approach, which is really a connection of reading the literature. Next slide, please. And then combining it with the experiences of University of Michigan and faculty and graduate students. So there's a well-developed literature on mentoring. Some of it comes directly from graduate students, but also some of it from the broader literature that describes the value of setting expectations and having two-way conversations about expectations. That needs to be contextualized, not only to the context of our university, but also to within a disciplinary context. So how those conversations look like in the social sciences would be quite different than in the sciences or in engineering. And next slide, please. So really the approach is to kind of apply a peer-to-peer conversation through these committees who run a number of workshops and then also produce resources that are available across the campus. And we've also found that we've really benefited from the cross-disciplinary perspective, though not directly of interest to NSF. Our approach does extend all the way through to social sciences and the humanities as well. Next slide. Thank you. So the MORE committee, again, that group of 10 to 12 faculty members offers 3 types of workshops. Probably the most critical one is what we call getting your mentoring relationship off to a good start. It's basically as a mentor-mentee pair are beginning to work together, often say in the first summer after a STEM student has begun, they can come to one of these MORE workshops. They're 90 minutes in duration, and they can have a facilitated two-way conversation that results in a mentoring plan using templates that we provide, but also are modifiable based on disciplinary interests. We also offer workshops for new faculty who have recently joined the University of Michigan, since we increasingly have expectations of mentoring plans at our university, and it's really helpful. New faculty are quite interested in how best to work productively with their new graduate students, and they are common participants in our workshops. At our most recent new faculty workshops, we had half of all the faculty that have been hired in that year at that one workshop at that particular time. We also will, at the invitation of departments, give workshops within the departments, and that gives the ability for a department to create from our templates a plan that would be appropriate, that would be useful to their own faculty. Thank you. Next slide. So just a little bit about what these templates look like, what mentoring plans look like. I'm not making any claims that of how this connects to the NSF requirements, though they have been extremely useful by faculty on our campus. And we have many faculty who regularly bring their new PhD students as they begin working with them year upon year to these workshops. If you're interested in the templates themselves, at rackham.umich.edu/mentoring, these are available as editable Google Docs, which is how our own faculty use them. They are our starting point, and then they'll modify them based on what their own interests and needs of the student are. In a nutshell, our mentoring plans are about creating shared expectations. It's as much about the conversation as the written plan. The plans tend to address milestones, shared expectations, what the student is able to offer, what the faculty member is able to offer, opportunities for travel and professional development on the part of students, what faculty members are expecting in terms of, for example, peer-reviewed publication and participation on grants, and then how feedback will be provided. Next slide, please. I'll just dive into these contents just a little bit more. This not only talks a little bit about how students, in addition to their primary mentor, may be able to receive supplementary mentoring from a variety of different faculty members, but it also gives a little sense of the broad sections of what typically are involved in a mentoring plan conversation. First would be the academic expectations on both sides. Another set would be around the well-being of the dyad, and then also professional development. And so the student has an opportunity to express their own interest in the degree and have those interests captured within the context of what the overall work will be as the two work together. Thank you. Next slide. Another component of the workshop is really to develop, to offer some kind of tips and skills and research around mentoring across difference, since increasingly students and faculty members have different identities, have traveled different paths. We offer both advice and from the faculty participants as to how to best mentor across that difference. Thanks. Next slide. So really, just in the last two slides to wrap up so that we have time for questions, just a little bit of a sense of how this project has looked at the University of Michigan. It has been a long-running project. One of my hopes in presenting to you all is that if your institutions are contemplating work like this, you might be able to do it a little more rapidly than we did. This committee dates to more than 10 years ago. It started out as a pilot activity. To be frank, when we had some of our first workshops, we were really pleased to have 10 faculty members from across the campus attend. Now we have many hundreds that are attending per term, and we have reached more than a quarter to a third of all faculty on campus at this time. We've progressively moved from mentoring plans, being very confident about talking about mentoring plans as a best practice, to now actually including it as an expectation. So if a faculty member is mentoring a PhD student at the University of Michigan, there is an expectation that they'll be working with their programs to develop mentoring plans. And we're on a 5-year journey to really propagate that across the whole campus. Thank you. Next slide. So just a little bit of evidence about kind of where we are in terms of this and what students themselves think about this. So at this point, this is data from a survey of PhD students that were undergoing, where their departments were undergoing a program review in this year. You can see that the uptake of mentoring plans, students that report having mentoring plans, is largest in the biological and health sciences, perhaps because of some of the NIH requirements, but also the interests of that division. It's about half. Physical science and engineering are at about a third, and our other two divisions are slightly lower. So on average, across our whole graduate school, or all PhD programs at the University of Michigan, about a third have mentoring plans. And I think the useful thing that we have carried forward over time and found consistently is that 4 in 5 students report that they find these plans useful. And faculty themselves also find these plans useful in the sense that they have created expectations about what they want, what they need, and are able to offer as part of their relationship in ways that promote PhD studies. One last slide then, just to acknowledge that to the Moore Committee itself as the kind of long-term author of these resources, and again, the website by which a number of the templates and the approach is available. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thanks to Deborah. I'm reviewing the questions here and would just like to reiterate that all the workshop materials will be made available to those who registered. That means that the PowerPoint presentations will be available, and And hopefully that will be helpful to people. We are also collating other resources, as have been mentioned in some of the questions. I think, Mike, this goes to you first, perhaps, but Deborah could weigh in. It sounds as though you've seen a shift in the cultural faculty's understanding and expectation around what we might call training or education around these mentoring practices. And you've been quite successful, as you've mentioned, in certainly changing the culture there. Are there some pearls of wisdom that you could share with us that maybe were really pivotal in you helping to make that shift?
I would say, thanks. That's a great question. And I've thought a lot about this because I would agree that there has been a sea change. What once was kind of seemed like we were walking uphill for many years, it does not seem like that anymore. So I would say two things. One is that as we got to a critical mass of faculty within departments, we heard back from departments that just as in an earlier period, faculty may not have had conversations about teaching, just so in this period, they actually had never had conversations about mentoring, and they found them extremely valuable to talk to colleagues about how to best do this work. And they learned a lot, and they saw the benefits in terms of how they engage with their students, just in terms of how they felt about the relationship with their students, but also things that we care about, like productivity of research. The second thing I would say is faculty are very sensitive to their own mental health and well-being, and also that of their students. And I think the thing that really put a lot of wind in our sails was a faculty task force on mental health and well-being on our campus that recommended that the best path to support graduate students was that they had mentoring plans. And at that point, things really took off on campus. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Deborah, is there anything that you would like to add from your experience?
The project that Mike has been doing at Michigan and with the other folks there is much longer going than the work that we've done at CSU Bakersfield. The piece that has been especially challenging for us is the stuff that I was talking about at the end, where, we were trying to figure out, like, you get some training, you learn some things about how to be a good mentor, but unless you look at what the impact is, you don't know whether or not you really are being a good mentor. And that's a really challenging thing to talk about with your peers. Like, you think, so I'll use myself. I think I'm a great mentor, but then when I look at the progress my students are having, am I actually having the impact that I'm intending to have? And if I'm not, I need to be able to change what I'm doing. And so hearing that feedback can be challenging. It can be hard. But I think it's really, really important. And we found that the faculty who are having the most success in terms of their students meeting those milestones at the expected rate, they were actually more critical of themselves, of their mentoring abilities. They were much more self-reflective and less confident in their abilities as mentors, even though they were really darn effective. So I think it's really, with undergraduate students, we have some markers. They're freshmen, they're sophomores, they're juniors, they're seniors. Having markers like that for graduate students is something that I think we need to develop, and we've been trying to do that at CSU Bakersfield so that we can then give that feedback to the faculty member and see, like, is the student progressing the way that we need them to progress?
I understand we're coming up on. Just ask one more question here as we come up on time. Are your efforts included in the promotion and tenure process in terms of mentoring from the graduate faculty side of things?
I'm happy to begin.
Briefly.
I think the answer to that depends on the school and college within the University of Michigan. I think there are discussions about the role of mentoring, but whether or not that is a formal part of tenure casebooks, which just for clarity, do happen outside the graduate school. That is the decision of the faculty and the provost, and it does vary by school and college here. So I would say that project is incomplete.
Incomplete. Thank you.
At
Thank you
CSU
so much
Baker-
to,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say really quickly, at CSU Bakersfield, we're having conversation about how to include that into the criteria. They're not there yet. What we're trying to do is see if we can incorporate them into what counts, how a faculty member gets graduate faculty standing.
thank you so much. Appreciate all of your hard work. And at this point, we will go on to the third section of today's webinar. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ellen Fisher, Vice President for Research at the University of New Mexico. And Ellen will be discussing with us how embedding mentorship into the responsible conduct of research efforts take place in her campus. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about what we've been doing at the University of New Mexico. I would also like to, at this point, acknowledge that a lot of what we've been doing is the result of the great work we have of our folks in our compliance office, which include Linda Mayo, Heather Canavan, Nika Mitchell, and Lene Ista, some of whom I know are signed into this webinar today. Next slide, please. So I decided to take this idea of the requirements from NSF specifically around mentorship training for faculty and to be a little tongue-in-cheek here. I think that my first response to NSF's changing the PAPG a year ago about requiring mentorship training for faculty, my first response was, wow, it's about time. I've been involved in RCR, RECR, scientific ethics training since 1995. And it always, to me, felt like NSF was sending a sort of a mixed message that there was a requirement for students to have this training, but not for their faculty. So it was really great on the one hand to see that. But from a VPR's perspective, the Vice President for Research, we have to consider what that means in terms of the compliance to these kinds of mandates from the funding agencies. So my second response was, oh, great, one more thing that we have to track and certify at an institutional level. So I thought I'd take a moment. Our NSF colleagues did talk about what was in the PAPG. I want to just highlight a couple of things. And again, looking at this from the institutional perspective or the institutional responsibility in general for RCR, and then specifically with respect to faculty. So if we could go to next slide, please. This is directly from the PAPG. The AOR is required to complete a certification. The institution has a plan to provide appropriate training, blah, 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 blah. We were doing this for graduate students and postdocs, but now we're doing faculty and other senior personnel, and that it explicitly has to address mentor training and mentorship. And then the second piece of this was that then while those training plans, the institutional training plans, are not going to be submitted with an individual proposal, they are subject to review upon request. And if you dig into the PAPG, if you go to the next slide, what you see in the more under recipient standards for RECR and the institutional responsibilities. Again, an institution must have a plan in place, and also that basically any personnel who will be supported by NSF, that's one requirement. The second is that it applies to the breadth of the research disciplines that the foundation funds. Training provided should be effective and must be appropriately tailored to the specific needs and circumstances at each institution. And therefore, NSF is not going to tell us how to do it, but we have to figure that out for ourselves. And then it goes on to the content that it must include mentor training and mentorship. And then again, that the plan is subject to review upon request. And then a couple other markers here is that an institution must designate one or more person to oversee the compliance with this requirement, and the institutions are responsible for verifying that that anybody who's being supported on an NSF grant has received training in the responsible and ethical conduct of research. So from a compliance standpoint, that's a lot that's being put onto the institutions that goes beyond what we've been talking about with respect to the individual responsibilities of a PI or maybe a department or a program kind of a level that we're charged with as an institution, being able to track it, making sure it's effective, making sure that's appropriately tailored to the needs of the institution, et cetera. So if we go to the next slide. So I think that if we just focus on having a plan, some of the questions that we've been wrestling with here at UNM, especially as it applies to including faculty and senior personnel in the RCR, RECR training is, do we go ahead and utilize the existing RCR, RECR training programs that we have for students, or do we develop brand new training programs for faculties and senior researchers? What's the value of doing that combined or separately? And at this point, I will tell you, spoiler alert, that we've been doing it in a combined fashion over the last year, and it's worked out, I think, reasonably well, and it actually has some real advantages. And when we think about some of the things that that were just talked about by our graduate deans around doing training, mentor-mentee training programs where, mentor-mentee pairs are in the same room, that there could be a lot of advantage to having those conversations with everybody in the room together. The other thing that we're charged with doing is determining what's the best mode to provide it. And I think that here the questions revolve around how do you provide flexibility and also meet the compliance standards, having them in person, online. Some professional organizations have mentoring and mentorship training programs. Do we count that as being equivalent to something that we might do in-house, and does it meet the compliance standards? What do we develop transcriptable courses so that students and others might have this on their transcripts from the institution, and also that there may be ad hoc homegrown mentoring programs, and that could be providing one aspect of the overall RCR, RECR training requirements for faculty. And so again, sort of verifying what's happening in those. And in some respects, I would say that we would like to be able to provide all of the above to a certain extent, and that goes to the flexibility piece, and also the piece that NSF says that it needs to be tailored to the needs of the institution. And so thinking about how we might develop a comprehensive program that has various pieces that do meet those needs has been sort of the thing that we've been working on doing at UNM. Next slide, please. And so the other piece that I wanted to point out here is that, again, this is really focused on faculty and senior personnel to ensure effective training. And I always love that, because how do we assess whether or not it's effective? And again, we just heard from people who've been doing these programs and talked about assessing that, and that's a real consideration here. But a couple of things that we have tried to incorporate is some creative ways to convince faculty that it really is in their best interest to fully participate in these programs. And I'm not going to read each of those bullet points, but we've been thinking about creative ways to name that it's not RCR training or RECR training, but really it's things like how to avoid being accused of misconduct, or how to ensure you can continue to get federal funding for your research. In the middle, providing practical tips. And I think we've heard that in a couple of different ways here. In our mentorship training that we've been doing thus far, we've really focused a lot on things like what causes there to be issues with or leads to poor mentorship. And that a lot has to do with mismatches in expectations, mismatches in personality styles, et cetera, between a mentor and a mentee. And rather than sort of focusing on one side of that relationship or the other, to really focus on the combination. Providing relevant case studies for discussion. We also have done something that I haven't heard yet in the others, that we've done some connections to civility and focused on behaviors and microaggressions. I actually think the more program that we just heard about did also focus on some of this. But we at UNM do have some rules around civility on campus. And then also we've connected it to safety and thinking about active shooter and space-specific plans for if an emergency is happening, and that also is part of good mentorship. And then also what tools and resources faculty need to be better mentors, and IDPs, coming up with creative ways to do IDPs, group policies, norms, implicit bias training, giving them specific campus-specific resources, conflict management, and references. Next slide, please. I also want to say that the tracking piece is something we worry a lot about. Making sure it's meaningful and comprehensive, ensuring department-centric or professional-centric offerings meet regulations. And then I would really like for us to really think about how this gets integrated more fully. It's not a one and done. It's not an inoculation situation. So how do we get people to incorporate this as part of culture? Next slide, please. And then lastly, I think this is my next to last slide. I want to just say that identifying resources is another thing that we worry about. We've done a lot of different things, and I don't need to go into all these, but just thinking about things like, you know, the regulations say we have to designate one or more persons. How are we doing that? Doing things that identifying resources to encourage people to come, including things like refreshments, providing different kinds of time and spaces, and advertising. Development of institution-specific materials, another mandate. Where does that come in? And then also the tracking system, using our learning management system through HR training, doing things through OSP, et cetera. So we've got a lot of considerations here, and we're essentially doing all of these as we move forward with a more comprehensive way to think about how we are offering this for faculty and senior personnel. Next slide. And just as a summary, I do think that excellence in research requires responsible and ethical conduct by all researchers, and the mentorship training perhaps is done better together, and then connection to useful resources and other important topics is really a way to get at good mentorship as well. Faculty engagement is critical, and then verification and tracking assurances. This is one of those things that keeps VPRs up at night, is how, if we're asked to present our plan to NSF, how do we go about doing that? And then how are we ensuring that we're effectively and accurately tracking the training and development that people are doing. So I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen. You covered a huge amount of material in a very short amount of time, and really appreciate that. For clarification, responsible conduct of research and responsible ethical conduct of research, or the RCR, that was a question that we had. I know we've got a very short amount of time before we wrap up. I'd be intrigued by how you see the relationship between your office and the graduate school, so that you understand which one of you is doing what part of all of this tracking and training and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I've been at UNM for about 3 years, and when I got here, we had somebody who was nominally within the graduate school who was doing some of the RCR training for graduate students. But my office was essentially funding that position. That person retired, and we moved it into compliance, because with the changes in the regulations, it felt much more like a compliance piece than a graduate education piece. But we're continuing to work with the graduate school to ensure that we're getting the right kinds of graduate education. And also, one of the things that I didn't really focus on was that we really want departments and programs to have their own specific training. And so making sure that we can identify which courses meet the federal requirements. So we are coordinating across with the graduate school to look at those specific courses that are already embedded within graduate programs that could meet these requirements. And so then we can track that through the transcriptable courses. And it's really where we have some gaps in those programs that we're trying to fulfill that for the entire university.
Thank you so much for that. At this time, I would like to turn back over to my good colleague, Suzanne Ortega, President of the Council of Graduate Schools. Thank you so much, Ellen.
presenters for the wealth of information. Thank you, attendees, for your fabulous questions. As we've said, we are going to try to circle back and provide an FAQ that it tackles some of the questions we simply could not get to today. So let me just give you a sense of our next steps. First, CGS will host a follow-up webinar for faculty on this same topic on June 18th, I think about the same time, but more details will follow shortly. The intention of that seminar really is to try to provide some examples of the use of professional development plans and mentoring tools at the faculty level as models for those who have not yet begun to consider how they might approach this in terms of the writing of their grants. In addition to that webinar, we are producing a collection of curated resources on mentoring that will be forthcoming in relatively short order. The resources are designed to respond to many of the questions raised by the audience and of use. Of course, I have to mention again that the material is based, this work is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation. And of course, any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations included in those materials will be those of its authors and not necessary. I have no idea how I muted myself. I also would like to invite you to participate in several other upcoming events. During our summer workshop in New Dean's Institute in Boston in early July, this topic of mentoring and the relationship between mentoring, diversity, equity, and inclusion agendas and student success will be prominently featured. In addition, I encourage you to look at the CGS website for a full listing of our webinar offerings, but we'll call your attention specifically to our next upcoming webinar on May 1st, focused on preparing PhD students in the humanities for their future careers, an interesting parallel to the issue of mentoring for first careers and diverse careers in STEM. So I want to thank you very much. Of course, I want to thank my CG. I don't know how I keep muting myself. And all of my other colleagues that I certainly hope I did not fail to name, but who are equally valued and important. So with that, thank you and have a good rest of your Tuesday.